The sun had barely risen over the rugged hills of the Pacific Island, painting the dense jungle in muted shades of green and brown. Mist clung stubbornly to the forest floor, and the air was thick with humidity, the kind that seeps into your clothes, your skin, your very bones. For months, Japanese soldiers had defended these islands with an unshakable belief the terrain was their ally. Steep ridges, jagged cliffs, and rivers choked with tangled roots and mud had kept enemy forces at bay for as long as anyone could remember. They believed that no vehicle, no matter how powerful, could traverse these inhospitable landscapes. Tanks? Impossible. Sherman tanks? Laughable. Yet, in the early hours of a fateful morning, that certainty was about to shatter. Far across the island, hidden by thick foliage and the natural curves of the land, a sound began to ripple. Through the silence, a low, metallic growl, like nothing the Japanese soldiers had heard before. It was not the usual staccato of rifle fire or the distant thump of artillery. This was heavier, more deliberate, a mechanical rumble that rolled across hills and valleys, defying logic, defying expectation. These were no ordinary vehicles. These were Sherman tanks, the mainstay of American armored forces, machines designed to crush defenses and dominate battlefields. But what made their sudden presence so shocking was not merely the fact that they existed, nor even their destructive power. It was that they had arrived where no one believed any tank could go, where maps had labeled impassable, where generals had shrugged and called certain routes suicide. Sherman tanks were now rolling, and the Japanese soldiers, disciplined and battle-hardened, found themselves staring at the impossible. To understand the weight of this moment, we must travel back to the months and years leading up to it. The Pacific War was a conflict defined by islands jungle-clad, volcanic and often unwelcoming. For Japanese forces, terrain was a weapon as much as any rifle or artillery piece. Their strategies had long relied on nature itself. Dense forests to conceal troop movements, steep cliffs to deter landings, and rivers that could turn a simple advance into a nightmarish slog through mud and sharp rocks. Every natural obstacle was meticulously studied, fortified, and incorporated into defensive plans. Engineers constructed hidden bunkers, cleverly camouflaged positions, and interconnected trenches that allowed a single soldier to hold off dozens of attackers. The islands became a fortress, and the soldiers within it believed themselves invincible, at least as far as the terrain was concerned. Meanwhile, the Americans, thousands of miles from home, faced a monumental task. Every campaign required crossing hundreds of miles of ocean, landing troops on hostile beaches, and pushing through jungles that seemed designed by nature itself to break armies. It was not enough to have numbers, ships, and planes. They needed ingenuity. They needed to think beyond conventional strategy, to adapt technology to environments where it had never been tested. Among their most daring ideas was the deployment of Sherman tanks in areas deemed impassable, where enemy defenses assumed only foot soldiers could tread. It was audacious, and on the surface, almost reckless. But for the men in command, hesitation was not an option. Victory demanded boldness, and the terrain that had long been a Japanese advantage would soon become a stage for one of the most astonishing feats of the Pacific campaign. The Shermans themselves were remarkable machines, weighing over 30 tons, powered by engines capable of moving at surprising speed for their size, and armored to withstand medium-caliber fire. They were designed for versatility. On open fields, their dominance was clear. In conventional battles, they were nearly unstoppable. But the jungles and hills of the Pacific presented a different challenge. Mud that could swallow men, roots that could rip through tires, cliffs that seemed to defy climbing. These were not environments in which a tank could simply roll forward. Yet, engineers and military planners had modified these machines, reinforcing their suspensions, equipping them with wide tracks to distribute weight over soft ground, and teaching crews how to maneuver through obstacles that would seem insurmountable to anyone else. The preparation was meticulous, the risks immense, and the rewards potentially game-changing. As dawn broke that morning, the first of these tanks appeared on the horizon to the Japanese defenders. They had been posted along what was considered a natural line of defense, a choke point where the jungle thinned and cliffs barred easy access. Scouts had reported movement, but nothing could prepare them for the sight that now unfolded. Emerging from the dense foliage, the metallic silhouettes of the Sherman tanks seemed to glide over mud, climb inclines, and crush undergrowth that should have stopped them cold. Soldiers froze in disbelief. Shouts were exchanged, rifles were raised, and then, in a moment that would haunt many for the rest of their lives, the first shells were fired from these machines. The jungle erupted into chaos. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The Japanese soldiers were trained to fight to the last man, to resist, to hold positions that seemed hopeless. Yet, even the most hardened among them were shaken by the realization that their inviolable terrain, the natural fortress they had trusted, was no longer an obstacle. Tanks were not just advancing, they were conquering. Hillsides, ridges, and riverbanks that had been deemed impassable were now avenues of destruction. The very earth they had relied upon to protect them had been turned into a stage for annihilation. This moment also highlighted a broader lesson about innovation and adaptability in warfare. Battles are not won merely by numbers or firepower alone, but by the ability to challenge assumptions, to see opportunities where others see barriers. The American forces had studied the terrain, understood its limitations, and refused to be constrained by conventional wisdom. Where Japanese commanders had placed their faith in mountains and mud, American planners placed theirs in engineering, training, and the audacity to defy expectation. In doing so, they forced the enemy to confront a truth no map could have prepared them for. The battlefield is only impassable if you accept it as such. Yet this was only the beginning. The arrival of the Shermans did not instantly decide the battle. Japanese troops quickly adapted, using every trick in their arsenal: concealed machine gun nests, snipers hidden in the trees, and booby traps set along the narrow paths the tanks had carved. The jungle became a deadly chessboard, each side maneuvering for advantage, each moment filled with tension. The tanks were powerful, but they were not invincible. Every advance required skill, courage, and an intimate understanding of both machine and environment. Every Japanese counterattack tested the limits of American tactics, forcing crews to innovate on the fly, to trust in their training and the durability of their steel beasts. For those witnessing it firsthand, the scene was almost surreal. Soldiers described hearing the roar of engines echo through valleys where no vehicle had ever traveled. They spoke of the ground trembling under the weight of the machines, of trees snapping and rolling aside like mere reeds. Some swore they could hear the jungle itself protesting, as if nature itself was astonished at this display of human ingenuity. And in the midst of it all, men on both sides faced a profound reality. War was no longer simply about courage or discipline. It was about who could imagine the impossible and bring it into being. The events of that morning also revealed something deeper about the human spirit under extreme circumstances. The Japanese soldiers, confronted with the unforeseen, were forced to grapple with fear, disbelief, and the collapse of their assumptions. The American crews, meanwhile, embodied determination, resilience, and ingenuity. Every incline they climbed, every mud pit they crossed, was a testament not just to technology, but to the people behind it. These were ordinary men doing extraordinary things, and in that tension, history was being written. As the hours passed, the battle unfolded in a way that would leave a lasting imprint on both sides. Skirmishes erupted around each Sherman, as Japanese soldiers sought to find weaknesses in their armor. The tanks moved methodically, clearing paths, supporting infantry, and opening routes previously considered impossible. The jungle, once a shield, became an arena where strategy, courage, and machinery collided in a chaotic dance. From a distance, observers would later recall the scene as almost cinematic. Tanks emerging from the mist, soldiers fighting desperately to repel an enemy that seemed to glide over every obstacle, and the jungle itself reduced to a battlefield, unlike any seen before in the Pacific. And yet, even amid this spectacle, the human cost was ever present. Men fell. The cries of the wounded echoed through the valleys. Smoke and fire mingled with the early morning mist. Victory was not guaranteed by technology alone. It was earned inch by inch, step by step, as soldiers faced death and destruction with unwavering resolve. The Shermans could crush trees and barriers, but they could not shield the men from loss, fear, or the chaos of combat. For both sides, the morning would leave scars, some visible, some etched forever in memory. By the end of that first day, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The Japanese soldiers who had once believed the terrain itself was on their side were now grappling with a new reality. Ingenuity, courage, and determination could redefine the battlefield. And the Americans, having demonstrated what was possible when conventional thinking was abandoned, had not only advanced but also delivered a psychological blow that would resonate long after the fighting ended. The story of those Sherman tanks is more than a tale of machines overcoming obstacles. It is a story of audacity, of men willing to challenge assumptions, and of the unpredictable nature of war itself. It is a reminder that no fortress is impregnable, no terrain insurmountable, and no victory inevitable. In the dense jungles of the Pacific, history was made that day not by sheer numbers, nor by the guns alone, but by the courage to do what others said could not be done. And as night fell over the battlefield, the exhausted survivors on both sides looked out over the paths carved by the tanks and the trails of destruction they had left behind. They had witnessed the impossible, and for many, the image of those Sherman tanks appearing where no one thought they would linger forever, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the relentless, unforgiving reality of war. The morning's shock had barely settled when the battle intensified. The Japanese defenders, once confident in the natural barriers surrounding their positions, scrambled to adapt. They had spent months, sometimes years, digging trenches, building camouflage bunkers, and fortifying hillsides that they believed were untouchable. Every tree, every rock, every narrow path had been carefully studied, and every man was trained to exploit these features. Yet now, they were confronted by a reality that defied every calculation. Sherman tanks were advancing where no human imagination had dared hope. The first encounters were chaotic and brutal. Infantrymen, armed with rifles and mortars, found themselves facing steel monsters that could crush trees, tear through bunkers, and fire shells that reduced stone and timber to splinters. Soldiers fired relentlessly, hoping to disable these strange vehicles, but their bullets bounced harmlessly off thick armor. Mortars shook the earth, but the tanks pressed forward, their wide tracks gripping mud and slopes that should have trapped them like insects in amber. Fear spread through the ranks, but so too did determination. The Japanese had learned to improvise under fire, and now they adapted with extraordinary speed. They dug improvised obstacles in the paths of the tanks, piling logs, rocks, and spiked metal. Mines were buried in muddy river crossings. Machine guns were mounted in hidden positions, aimed at the narrowest approaches where the tanks might be vulnerable. Each engagement became a tense game of strategy, a deadly dance in which one wrong move could mean annihilation. The Japanese knew the terrain intimately, and for a time, it seemed as if they might succeed in slowing the seemingly unstoppable machines. Yet the Americans had not come unprepared. Crews had trained for months in the most difficult conditions imaginable. They had learned to read the land, to anticipate ambushes, and to maneuver in ways that turned obstacles into advantages. Engineers accompanied the tanks, carrying tools to cut through undergrowth, remove debris, and construct makeshift bridges where rivers or gullies blocked the way. Infantry followed closely, providing cover and support, ready to repel counterattacks. Every movement was calculated, every advance deliberate, yet the effect was terrifyingly fluid, like a force of nature moving with mechanical precision through a landscape that had once been considered untouchable. One of the most remarkable aspects of this advance was the psychological effect it had on the Japanese soldiers. Fear is a powerful weapon in war, and the sudden appearance of these tanks struck terror into troops who had never imagined facing armored vehicles in such terrain. Commanders shouted orders to rally men, but hesitation and confusion spread. Some units abandoned positions entirely, fleeing into the jungle to escape a threat they could neither stop nor fully understand. Others stood their ground, determined to fight to the last man only to be overwhelmed by the sheer power and persistence of the Shermans. There were moments that seemed almost cinematic in their improbability. Accounts from survivors described tanks scaling slopes that were supposed to be unclimbable, their tracks tearing into roots and rocks, engines growling with relentless determination. In some cases, tanks emerged from dense thickets where visibility was nearly zero, surprising soldiers who had thought themselves safely concealed. Shells tore through hidden bunkers, and machine guns mounted on the tanks cut down infantry that had assumed they were out of range. It was a battle in which the rules of reality seemed to bend machines and men, moving in ways no one had imagined, against an enemy who refused to surrender. The terrain itself became a character in this story, reacting in unexpected ways. Mudslides, uprooted trees, and collapsing cliffs sometimes threatened both attackers and defenders alike. Rivers swelled with rain, slowing movement and turning paths into quagmires. Yet, the Sherman crews adapted, using winches, chains, and sheer determination to press forward. Engineers rigged temporary crossings, while infantry cleared underbrush and suppressed enemy fire. Every obstacle was a test of skill. Every inch gained a small triumph over nature and human resistance alike. Interesting details from those encounters reveal just how inventive both sides had to be. Japanese soldiers learned to hide in trees, firing down on tanks with explosives attached to bamboo poles. They dug shallow pits to trap wheels, hoping to immobilize the machines long enough to destroy them. Some even attempted to guide tanks into narrow gullies where they might become trapped. The Americans, for their part, modified tactics on the spot. Crews fired from multiple angles, coordinated with infantry to flank positions, and used the weight and momentum of the tanks to flatten or bypass obstacles. It became a test not just of strength, but of ingenuity, courage, and split-second decision-making. One particularly harrowing engagement took place along a riverbank that had been deemed impassable. Japanese defenders had concentrated their forces there, believing the terrain would prevent any armored advance. But the Sherman tanks, with their tracks churning through mud and undergrowth, emerged from the jungle in perfect formation. The defenders opened fire, but their rounds bounced harmlessly off the armor. One tank used its weight to collapse a natural embankment, creating a makeshift bridge for its companions. In the ensuing chaos, the Americans pushed forward, and the Japanese position was overrun. Survivors later recalled watching the tanks seemingly defy gravity and logic, climbing what had been called sheer cliffs and plowing through vegetation that had been considered a barrier. The advance was not without cost. Each tank, each crew, faced danger at every turn. Mines could rip tracks apart, snipers could target vulnerable points, and artillery, when accurately aimed, could inflict damage. Crews had to be constantly vigilant, adjusting to sudden threats while maintaining momentum. Infantry suffered casualties as well, moving alongside the machines through hostile jungle, facing hidden shooters, and navigating terrain that was as treacherous as the enemy. The human element, the courage, skill, and resilience of these men was as important as the steel of the tanks themselves. The psychological warfare continued as well. For Japanese soldiers, every tank that emerged where none should have been struck a blow not just to their positions but to their morale. The fear of the impossible became a tangible presence. Rumors spread among the ranks that no position was safe, that every hill, river, and jungle path could be breached. Even the most disciplined troops found themselves doubting, hesitating, questioning orders. That mental strain, combined with the relentless advance of the tanks, eroded their ability to coordinate and resist. Meanwhile, American commanders observed the effect with keen satisfaction. They understood that breaking the enemy's morale could be as decisive as breaking their lines. The Shermans had become more than vehicles. They were symbols of ingenuity, audacity, and unstoppable force. Every successful maneuver through the impossible terrain was proof that planning, preparation, and daring could overcome even the most formidable natural defenses. Despite the odds, the Japanese forces did not surrender immediately. They adapted, regrouped, and fought with remarkable tenacity. Hidden machine guns, booby traps, and sudden counterattacks kept the Americans cautious. Crews learned to anticipate ambushes, to coordinate with infantry, and to use the terrain to their advantage in ways that preserved both tank and man. Each engagement became a delicate balance between aggression and caution, between seizing the initiative and respecting the lethal unpredictability of the environment. There were moments that tested the limits of both human and machine. Tanks became stuck in mud or debris, requiring crews to dig, lever, and chain themselves free. Soldiers had to cling to moving vehicles, navigating steep slopes and slippery banks. Explosions rocked the ground, sending mud and water cascading down hillsides. Smoke mingled with morning mist, obscuring vision and creating confusion. Yet, each time, the tanks emerged, battered but functional, continuing their relentless advance. The jungle, it seemed, was no match for determination backed by skill and preparation. By midday, it became evident that the impassable terrain was yielding. Hills that had once been considered natural fortresses were now dotted with American positions. River crossings that had seemed insurmountable were conquered, with tanks and infantry working in unison. Japanese soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to fall back, often leaving behind equipment and fortification. The Shermans had not only advanced, they had rewritten the rules of the battlefield, showing that ingenuity, courage, and perseverance could redefine what was possible. And yet, amidst the victories, the cost was clear. Men on both sides were wounded, some permanently. Equipment was lost, some tanks disabled or damaged by hidden obstacles. The jungle itself bore the scars of the conflict, trees crushed, undergrowth flattened, paths carved through hills and riverbanks. The battle was not won without sacrifice, and each advance was paid for in sweat, blood, and grit. By the end of the day, observers would later recount the surreal nature of the battle. Tanks appeared in places no one believed they could reach. Soldiers fought in conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. The jungle, once a sanctuary for defenders, had been transformed into a proving ground for ingenuity and courage, and through it all the American forces had demonstrated a simple but profound truth. No terrain is impassable, no obstacle insurmountable, if one is willing to challenge assumptions and push beyond fear. The stories of these engagements, passed down through survivor accounts and military reports, paint a vivid picture of determination, audacity, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. Every maneuver, every improvisation, every moment of bravery contribute to a larger narrative, one in which the impossible became reality. The Japanese soldiers, trained to rely on terrain, were forced to reconsider everything they had known. The American crews, trained to innovate and adapt, proved that human skill and machine power could overcome even the most daunting challenges. As the sun began to set, the jungle fell into an uneasy silence. Smoke still drifted from smoldering positions. The echoes of gunfire faded, and the men on both sides took stock of what had occurred. The Shermans, covered in mud and battle scars, rested on hillsides they should never have reached. The Japanese troops, weary and demoralized, prepared for the next encounter, now aware that no position was truly safe. The battle was far from over, yet the day had already left an indelible mark on the island, on its defenders, and on history itself. In the hours that followed, the lessons of that day would resonate. The impossible had been conquered. The terrain, long considered the ultimate defense, had been breached, and the Sherman tanks, moving where logic said they could not, had demonstrated that courage, preparation, and ingenuity could redefine the very nature of warfare. If you're ready, I can continue with Part 3, delivering the climax, intense confrontations, and a powerful conclusion that ties together the heroism, ingenuity, and consequences of this incredible campaign. As the next day dawned, the island seemed almost transformed. The dense jungle, which had long been a shield for the Japanese defenders, was now scarred with tracks, splintered trees, and makeshift paths carved by the relentless advance of the Sherman tanks. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, mud, and the metallic tang of war. For the Japanese soldiers, the morning brought a grim realization. Their stronghold, their impassable terrain, was no longer a sanctuary. What had begun as disbelief the previous day had now hardened into fear. And fear is a weapon more powerful than any gun. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward with calculated precision. Each tank, each squad of infantry, moved as part of a larger, orchestrated effort. Commanders coordinated maneuvers with maps and compasses, but also with instinct and experience, reading the land and predicting the enemy's responses. The Japanese had learned to rely on nature. The Americans had learned to turn it into an ally. Every river crossing, every ridge, every narrow path became an opportunity, a way to outflank the enemy, disrupt their defenses, and strike where they least expected it. It was during these movements that some of the most daring feats occurred. Tanks climbed inclines so steep that observers swore they defied gravity. Crews emerged from thick mangroves and hidden valleys, confronting positions that had been carefully fortified and thought untouchable. In one dramatic encounter, a tank commander ordered his crew to advance along a ravine choked with mud and roots. Japanese soldiers had prepared an ambush, hoping the narrow path would trap the vehicle. The tank pressed forward anyway, its tracks churning through the muck, engines growling, and with a final, almost theatrical lurch, it emerged on the other side, unscathed and unstoppable. Witnesses later described the scene as almost surreal, metal and man moving with the force of nature itself. The Japanese soldiers responded with ingenuity of their own. Machine guns hidden in trees rained fire on advancing troops. Mines were planted in every conceivable spot. Snipers targeted tank crews with deadly precision. Yet the Americans adapted with equal creativity. Infantry covered flanks, engineers cleared obstacles under fire, and tanks used their weight to break through barriers. Communication, timing, and split-second decisions became the difference between survival and disaster. Every encounter was a high-stakes chess game where a single mistake could be fatal. One of the most intense moments came when a column of Shermans approached a cliffside ridge that overlooked a river valley. The Japanese had prepared a deadly ambush, logs rigged to roll, mines buried along the path, and snipers stationed in concealed tree position. As the first tank approached, it triggered a small landslide, sending debris crashing down the slope. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring vision. The second tank moved cautiously, but the third tank, with a boldness that would become legendary, surged forward, its tracks gripping mud and rock, and smashed through the remaining obstacles. In the chaos, the Japanese defenders were forced to retreat, their carefully prepared trap rendered ineffective. The psychological impact of these feats was profound. Japanese soldiers who had once trusted the land now questioned every assumption. Hills, rivers, and forests that had seemed safe were now avenues of destruction. Rumors of invincible tanks spread among the ranks, further eroding morale. Some units surrendered, unable to face an enemy who seemed to materialize in impossible places. Others fought on, determined not to yield, but each engagement left them more weary, more demoralized, and more aware that the rules of the battlefield had changed. Amid the relentless advance, the human cost remained ever present. Soldiers on both sides were killed or wounded. The jungle, once a silent observer, had become a chaotic battlefield of mud, smoke, and fire. Tanks were damaged, sometimes temporarily immobilized by obstacles or hidden explosives. Infantry faced ambushes, sniper fire, and treacherous footing. Each victory was measured in courage, endurance, and the ability to adapt under pressure. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the American forces pressed forward, driven by strategy, determination, and the knowledge that breaking the enemy's line here could have decisive consequences. The climax of the campaign came when the Shermans reached a key strategic ridge, the last natural barrier before a critical Japanese stronghold. The defenders had concentrated their forces here, confident that the terrain would protect them. But the American crews, having already proven the impossible was possible, approached with unshakable determination. Tanks moved in coordinated formations, flanking the ridge from multiple angles, while infantry provided suppressive fire. Mines were cleared, snipers neutralized, and hidden bunkers destroyed under the precise firepower of the Shermans. The defenders were overwhelmed, their positions systematically dismantled. Witnesses later described the scene as breathtaking. The ridge, once considered unassailable, was now a mosaic of mud, broken vegetation, and twisted metal. Smoke rose from destroyed bunkers. Soldiers emerged from the jungle, weary but alive, having witnessed feats they had thought impossible. The Shermans, battered and scarred, stood victorious, their tracks marking the ground like the signature of a force that had redefined the limits of warfare. It was not just a physical victory, it was a psychological one. The Japanese defenders had been forced to confront the unimaginable, and the reality of American ingenuity and courage had reshaped the battlefield. In the aftermath, the lessons were clear. War is as much about imagination as it is about firepower. Terrain can protect, but it cannot stop determination. Even the most formidable natural defenses can be overcome when human skill, ingenuity, and audacity are applied. The Sherman tanks had done more than advance. They had demonstrated a fundamental truth. Assumptions can be shattered, and the impossible can be achieved when men refuse to be constrained by fear or convention. For the Japanese soldiers, the consequences were profound. Retreat, reorganization, and reflection followed. Many would carry the memory of those tanks, metal monsters that defied logic throughout their lives. The shock of seeing the impossible become reality left an imprint on their understanding of warfare, strategy, and human ingenuity. For the American crews, the campaign was a testament to training, courage, and the power of innovation. Every inch gained was a triumph of coordination, skill, and unyielding determination. As the sun set over the island, the battlefield lay quiet once more, but it was forever changed. Trails of destruction marked the advance of the Shermans. Hillsides that had once seemed impregnable were breached. Rivers and ridges that had been thought impassable now bore the tracks of armored vehicles and the footsteps of determined men. The island itself seemed to acknowledge the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Upon it, nature itself humbled by the audacity of human resolve. History would remember this campaign not simply for the battles fought, but for what it revealed about human ingenuity, courage, and the ability to overcome the impossible. The Sherman tanks had achieved what was considered unthinkable, and in doing so, they had changed the course of the conflict on that island. The Japanese defenders, forced to confront new realities, adapted where they could, but the impact of that moment, the appearance of tanks in terrain they believed impassable, would linger long after the last shots were fired. This story is more than a tale of armored vehicles or battlefield strategy. It is a story of vision, courage, and determination. It is a reminder that in war, as in life, obstacles can be overcome when men refuse to be constrained by fear or assumption. It is a testament to the human spirit, to the willingness to face the impossible, and to the enduring truth that with preparation, innovation, and courage, even the most formidable challenges can be conquered. The memory of those tanks rolling through mud, climbing impossible slopes, and crushing the natural defenses of the Japanese positions, endures because it symbolizes more than military might. It symbolizes the triumph of human ingenuity over expectation, of courage over fear, and of relentless determination over seemingly insurmountable odds. Those Sherman tanks were more than machines, they were agents of change, rewriting the rules of the battlefield and leaving an indelible mark on history. And as the island settled into quiet once more, the echoes of that campaign lingered. The impossible had been achieved. The terrain that had seemed invincible had been mastered. Men had faced fear, uncertainty, and death itself, and had emerged victorious through ingenuity, courage, and sheer resolve. It was a lesson that would resonate far beyond that island, far beyond that war. Nothing is truly impossible, and history is written by those who dare to challenge it.